In the dense jungles of Bougainville, over 40,000 Japanese soldiers vanished into green hell. But here's what haunts military historians to this day. 87% of them never fired a shot at the enemy. They didn't die charging Allied positions. They didn't fall defending fortified bunkers. They simply disappeared into the jungle one by one, consumed by an enemy far more ruthless than any army. Starvation, disease, and complete abandonment. This wasn't a battle. It was a slow-motion massacre orchestrated by isolation itself. While back home, Japanese propaganda celebrated glorious last stands and honorable deaths in combat, the reality on Bougainville told a different story entirely. Men trained for warfare instead spent their final days too weak to stand, hallucinating from malaria, their uniforms hanging off skeletal frames as they desperately chewed tree bark and searched for anything remotely edible. The island became a graveyard without markers, where the jungle itself was the executioner. American and Australian forces didn't need to storm Japanese positions. They simply cut them off, surrounded them, and waited. What followed was one of the most devastating strategic collapses in Pacific War history. A campaign where victory was achieved not through firepower, but through calculated neglect. How did an entire army, tens of thousands strong, equipped with weapons and ammunition, end up dying without resistance? What series of catastrophic decisions led to this silent annihilation? And why has this tragedy remained buried in the footnotes of history, overshadowed by more dramatic Pacific battles? The answer reveals the darkest side of warfare, where death comes not with a bang, but with the quiet desperation of men abandoned by their own command. Bougainville sits in the Solomon Islands chain, a mountainous jungle island roughly 125 miles long. In 1942, Japan recognized its strategic value immediately. The island could serve as a vital link in their defensive perimeter, a launching point for attacks on Allied shipping lanes, and a buffer protecting their major base at Rabaul on New Britain. By late 1942, Japanese forces had established a significant presence on Bougainville, constructing airfields and fortifications. They built bases at Buin in the south, Kieta on the east coast, and Buka in the north. At its peak, approximately 65,000 Japanese troops occupied the island, supported by supply lines from Rabaul. The dense jungle terrain, towering mountains, and disease-ridden swamps made Bougainville one of the most inhospitable environments in the Pacific theater. The Japanese command viewed Bougainville as nearly impregnable. The jungle itself served as a natural defense, and they believed any Allied invasion would be costly and prolonged. They fortified their positions, stockpiled what supplies they could, and prepared for the inevitable American advance. When U.S. Marines landed at Cape Torokina on the western coast on November 1, 1943, they weren't aiming to conquer the entire island. Under the command of Admiral William Halsey, the strategy was deliberate and calculated. Establish a defensive perimeter, build airfields within that perimeter, and use air power to neutralize Japanese positions elsewhere on the island. This was the beginning of what would become known as the island hopping, or leapfrogging strategy, taken to its logical extreme. The initial landing caught Japanese forces off guard. The Americans quickly established a beachhead and began constructing airstrips. By December, American aircraft were operating from Bougainville, striking Japanese shipping and installations throughout the region. But rather than pushing inland to engage the bulk of Japanese forces, American commanders did something unexpected. They stopped advancing. The Japanese, anticipating a full-scale invasion, prepared massive counterattacks. In March 1944, they launched their largest offensive, throwing 15,000 troops against American positions. It was a disaster. The attack failed catastrophically, with Japanese forces suffering over 8,000 casualties, while American losses remained under 300. This failed offensive shattered Japanese combat strength on the island and consumed precious supplies they couldn't replace. After the failed March offensive, the strategic situation for Japanese forces on Bougainville transformed from challenging to impossible. American control of the sea and air meant that no supplies could reach the island. Ships attempting to bring food, medicine, or ammunition were intercepted and destroyed. Submarines occasionally made it through, but their cargo capacity was minimal compared to the needs of tens of thousands of troops. The Japanese garrison commander, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, faced an impossible mathematics problem. he had approximately 40,000 combat troops remaining after the failed offensive, plus support personnel and naval forces scattered across the island. These men needed food, and the island's natural resources were insufficient to support them. In April 1944, Australian forces began replacing American troops in the perimeter around Torokina. The Australian Army, under Lieutenant General Stanley Savage, adopted a more aggressive containment strategy. Rather than remaining purely defensive, Australian patrols pushed out from the perimeter, establishing outposts and conducting reconnaissance in force. They weren't trying to conquer the island through direct assault. Instead, they were tightening the noose, restricting Japanese movement and access to what little food sources existed. Japanese troops attempted to establish gardens and farms in the jungle. They planted sweet potatoes, taro, and vegetables, but the yield was pathetically inadequate. The volcanic soil in many areas was poor, the jungle canopy blocked sunlight, and Allied bombing raids deliberately targeted any clearing that might contain crops. Soldiers received rations that dwindled from meager to nearly non-existent. By mid-1944, the daily food ration for Japanese soldiers on Bougainville had dropped to a fraction of what was needed for survival. Men were consuming perhaps 500 calories per day, sometimes less. They supplemented this with whatever they could find: jungle plants, roots, insects, snails. Some units resorted to eating grass. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making soldiers vulnerable to the diseases that infested the jungle. Communication between Japanese units broke down as radio equipment failed and messengers disappeared into the jungle. Small outposts became isolated. Men stationed at remote positions waited for supplies and reinforcements that would never come. Some groups, cut off completely, survived for months eating nothing but palm hearts and whatever small animals they could catch. The island was fragmenting into dozens of isolated pockets, each slowly starving. The jungle itself became the primary killer. Bougainville's tropical environment was a perfect breeding ground for disease, and malnourished soldiers had no resistance. Malaria ravaged the Japanese garrison with devastating efficiency. Without adequate quinine or other antimalarial drugs, men fell ill by the thousands. The disease came in waves, causing high fevers, violent chills, and complete physical collapse. Malaria wasn't the only threat. Dysentery spread through units, leaving men too weak to move from their shelters. Tropical ulcers developed from the smallest scratch or insect bite, expanding into gaping, infected wounds that ate away flesh down to the bone. In the humid jungle environment, these ulcers wouldn't heal. Men watched their own bodies literally rot away while they were still alive. Beriberi, caused by severe vitamin B deficiency, crippled soldiers' nervous systems. Victims experienced paralysis, heart failure, and swelling so severe that their skin would split open. Scrub typhus, dengue fever, and various fungal infections added to the medical catastrophe. Japanese medical facilities, already undersupplied, became overwhelmed morgues where doctors could do nothing but watch men die. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Soldiers who had trained for combat, who expected to die honorably in battle, instead found themselves wasting away in jungle shelters, too weak even to stand. Many stopped eating entirely, giving up on survival. Suicide rates climbed. Men who had survived months of starvation and disease simply walked into the jungle and never returned. Australian patrols pushing through the jungle discovered Japanese positions where men had died at their posts, still holding their weapons. They found shelters containing only skeletal remains, sometimes arranged in neat rows, as if the last survivors had laid out their dead comrades before succumbing themselves. In some cases, Allied forces encountered Japanese soldiers so emaciated and diseased that they couldn't even raise their hands in surrender. The monsoon season made everything worse. Heavy rains turned the jungle floor into swamps. Shelters collapsed. The cold, wet conditions accelerated the spread of respiratory infections. Men who had somehow survived months of deprivation died of pneumonia in their flooded foxholes. Water sources became contaminated, spreading cholera and dysentery even further. By late 1944, death had become so commonplace that it barely registered. Soldiers woke each morning uncertain whether their companions from the night before would still be alive. Bodies couldn't always be buried. The men lacked the strength to dig graves. The jungle began to smell of death, and that smell permeated everything. What makes the Bougainville tragedy particularly devastating was that it was preventable, at least in terms of military options. Japanese high command knew the situation on the island. They received reports about the starvation, the disease, the complete breakdown of the garrison. Yet they made a conscious decision. Bougainville was expendable. In mid-1944, Japan's strategic position across the Pacific was collapsing. American forces were advancing through the Central Pacific and New Guinea. The defense of the Philippines took priority over everything else. Bougainville, already neutralized as a threat by American air power, simply didn't matter anymore in the larger strategic picture. No serious evacuation effort was ever organized. Unlike the evacuation of Guadalcanal in early 1943, where Japan successfully withdrew troops under difficult conditions, no such operation was attempted for Bougainville. The garrison was written off, left to tie down Allied forces through its mere existence. The men there became strategic sacrifices, their slow death serving as a distraction from more important theaters. General Hyakutake and his staff recognized their abandonment. They sent increasingly desperate messages, requesting supplies, medical aid, or evacuation. The responses grew vaguer and less frequent until they stopped coming entirely. By early 1945, the garrison on Bougainville had been forgotten by Tokyo. They existed in official records but nowhere else. Some historians argue this represented a ruthless but logical strategic calculation. The troops on Bougainville, by simply surviving and maintaining their presence, forced Allied forces to keep units stationed there that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. In this view, the garrison served its purpose even in dying. But this cold logic ignored the human cost and the complete breakdown of the military's obligation to its own soldiers. The abandonment extended beyond simple supply failures. No reinforcements were sent. No new commanders arrived. No strategic guidance came from higher headquarters. The garrison existed in a vacuum, cut off not just physically, but organizationally from the rest of the Japanese military. They became ghosts, still technically part of the Imperial Army, but functionally erased from operational planning. For the men on the ground, this abandonment was psychologically crushing. Japanese military culture emphasized loyalty, duty, and sacrifice, but it also assumed reciprocal obligation from commanders to their troops. That contract had been broken. The soldiers on Bougainville understood they had been left to die, not in glorious battle, but through calculated neglect. As 1945 progressed, the situation on Bougainville devolved beyond mere military disaster into pure humanitarian catastrophe. Australian forces, now under the command of General Savage, continued their containment operations. They pushed Japanese forces back from the coast, restricting access to fishing grounds and further limiting food sources. The strategy was deliberate: compress Japanese-held territory, eliminate their ability to sustain themselves, and wait. In March 1945, Australian forces launched a series of limited offensives aimed at capturing key Japanese positions. These operations succeeded with relatively light casualties on the Australian side. Japanese resistance, when it occurred, was weak and disorganized. Many positions were found abandoned, their defenders having already succumbed to starvation or disease. Some Japanese soldiers surrendered, something that had been nearly unthinkable earlier in the war. They were too weak to fight, too hungry to care about honor. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, approximately 23,000 Japanese troops on Bougainville were still alive out of the original 65,000. But alive is perhaps too generous a description. Thousands were within days or weeks of death, their bodies so ravaged by malnutrition and disease that many wouldn't survive to see repatriation. When Australian forces entered Japanese-held areas after the surrender, they encountered scenes that would haunt them for decades. Entire camps contained only the dead and dying. Men too weak to stand lay in their own filth, unable even to swat away the flies that covered them. The few who could still walk appeared more like walking skeletons than human beings. Medical officers estimated that many weighed less than 80 pounds. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Of the approximately 65,000 Japanese military personnel on Bougainville during the campaign, about 18,500 died in actual combat operations. The remaining deaths, over 23,000 men, occurred due to starvation, disease, and the breakdown of the garrison. This means that roughly 62% of all Japanese deaths on Bougainville came not from Allied weapons, but from the consequences of isolation and abandonment. But the most striking number is this. In the final year of the campaign, from mid-1944 to the surrender, combat deaths were minimal. The vast majority of Japanese soldiers who died during this period never engaged Allied forces at all. They died in jungle shelters, in isolated outposts, along trails while trying to reach food sources that didn't exist. They died unseen by the enemy, their passing unmarked except by the comrades too weak to bury them properly. The tragedy of Bougainville stands as one of the most devastating examples of what happens when military strategy divorces itself completely from human cost. These weren't soldiers who died gloriously in battle, defending their positions to the last man. They were abandoned, sacrificed not for tactical gain, but for the abstract strategic value of their mere continued existence. The island became a laboratory for a particular kind of warfare, the victory through encirclement and isolation, where the enemy defeats itself through deprivation. American and Australian forces demonstrated that in certain circumstances, actively attacking fortified positions was unnecessary. Simply cutting off supplies and waiting achieved the same strategic objective at a fraction of the cost. For the families back in Japan, the truth remained hidden for years. Official notifications spoke vaguely of deaths in service without explaining the circumstances. The men who died on Bougainville didn't receive the hero's recognition accorded to those who fell in more dramatic battles. Their story was uncomfortable, revealing the ugly reality behind the propaganda of honorable sacrifice. The Allied forces who witnessed the aftermath were deeply affected. Australian soldiers who had fought against Japanese troops for years, who had experienced the brutality of jungle warfare firsthand, found themselves disturbed by what they discovered. These weren't fearsome enemies anymore. They were victims of a strategic system that had consumed them without mercy. Today, Bougainville's jungles still hold the remains of thousands who died there. Unlike other Pacific battlefields, where bodies were recovered and memorials erected, many of Bougainville's dead were simply swallowed by the jungle. They died without witnesses, without monuments, their sacrifice acknowledged by neither side in any meaningful way. The question haunts military historians. Was it worth it? Did the strategic value of tying down Allied forces justify the slow death of tens of thousands? The answer depends on perspective, but for the men who died on that remote island, far from home, too weak to fight or even flee, the question itself would have seemed absurd. They died not because of grand strategy or tactical necessity, but because war creates situations where human beings become expendable variables in calculations made far away. Bougainville teaches us that the most terrible deaths in war aren't always the most dramatic. Sometimes the greatest tragedy occurs in silence, in forgotten corners of the conflict, where men die not with weapons in their hands, but with nothing left to fight for and nowhere left to go.